Last week, when we started this study, we talked about the first chapter, obviously, and a little dip into the second chapter. King Cyrus has risen to the throne. He is a Persian leader. The Medes and the Persians took over Babylonia, the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And according to prophecy, according to God's will, you could say, as another way of looking at it, the king of Persia decided that he would let this lowly shepherd people, as they had been viewed in the past at least, to go back to their homeland, where they were taken from 70 years before. And the main purpose, I won't say the sole purpose, but one of the primary purposes of that, in God's eyes, was for them to go back and rebuild the temple. That was, maybe I shouldn't even say the primary purpose, but the foremost priority after they go back was to rebuild the temple, the house of God as it was thought of, and really the dwelling place of God as he himself said. Of course, as we point out, even Solomon, as he built the temple and consecrated it and dedicated it, understood God wasn't really there. But he, in a sense, God said, I will make my name dwell there. And that made it a very special place, not to mention the fact that that's where they would partake in the worship ordinances, or for lack of a better word, that God had commanded them through Moses. So they were going back, and all we saw last week was that they went back. A relatively small number of them went back. And they had tasks assigned to them. There were people, as Cyrus said, anybody whose heart has been stirred up to go and do this thing, to go back and to do this work. And there were some who did not go back, but they weren't off the hook by any means. They were to help in whatever way they could without going and donating their time and muscle, if you will. They were to donate other means that would also be just as necessary as required to do this thing. So that's what they did. And we read that they went back. They did go back. They arrived. As we pointed out, there was 3 different deportations, but we're focusing not really on that yet. But Zerubbabel was going to be the leader of this first one. And the end of chapter 2 says that according to their ability, they gave to the treasury of the work 61,000 derricks of gold and 5,000 minas of silver, 100 priest garments. Now the priests, the Levites, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants lived in their towns, and all the rest of Israel in their towns. There may be a little bit of significance in that that prepositional phrase that's repeated twice in that verse. They all went back to their own separate towns, and that may have facilitated a procrastination on their part. It seems. We'll see as we go along here. But Jerusalem, as we saw last week, was very much big enough for 42,000 people. But it seems that rather than all going to live in Jerusalem, they spread out around the surrounding area, it would seem, in the villages and towns, which wouldn't be ideal whenever you're going there to get a job done in building the temple, which was going to be in one place, which is where it was before. It already had a site. Now they just have to rebuild it. But that's how chapter 2 ends, and they had some difficulties. They were going to face some difficulties. Might be a good time to point out that whenever we read about the Old Testament Israel, or what we might call the Old Testament church, we can learn lessons from it for the New Testament church. There are lessons to be learned all throughout Scripture. Things that they experienced, how they overcame those things, the adversity, spiritual principles of separating yourself from the surrounding nations, not being like them, or figuratively speaking, driving them out from you, in a sense. Spiritually, we have spiritual applications to these principles, even when it may seem like to the naked eye or on a surface. What is this? Why are we studying this? What do we have? How can we learn from this? Well, there's always something to learn. There's always something that we can learn from almost everything, especially in Scripture. So the resettlement process was a little bit more complicated maybe than they thought, because there were people there, at least nearby, around. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It's kind of a deja vu type situation, just maybe not as extensive. But 70 years is plenty of time for other people to have, wherever they came from, to have started to be in that general location. And there were people around that were not necessarily going to be overly friendly and supportive, but were going to be, to some extent or another, and probably various degrees over time, thorns in the side, if you will, of the resettlers. But they determined that they were going to do this thing, and as it goes along, we're going to see how much they struggled, not just in building of the temple, but also in the building of the city walls, which would come next later during Nehemiah's ministry. But finally, after they settled in their towns, whether that was a good thing or not, the text is just neutral. It just gives the facts, as it is always inclined to do. What we read in chapter 3 is this: when the 7th month came, and the children of Israel were in the towns, the people gathered as one man to Jerusalem. So 7 months, it seems, it says the 7th month. Since there's no other indicator in there, it would seem that the most natural interpretation of when the 7th month came was either based on a former reference to a month, or maybe 7 months after they got there. But at any rate, it doesn't really make any difference in the end. What matters, what's actually being recorded here, is that now they gathered as one man to Jerusalem. They had been in their towns, building their, lives back up, it seems, or this new life. Remember, they left everything they ever knew, because almost everybody that came back had never known anything but where they were in that foreign land. So at any rate, it's going to be a new life. So they went to their own towns, but now they're going to gather as one man. I like that. I like the way that sounds, that language. It's probably not the way we would say it, but I like it. What do you think it means to gather as one man? Okay, unified? One mind. And we know what that mind was, right? It was, let's build this temple. That was it. God, this is the house of God. It's a great tragedy that what has befallen it, and they would have understood by this point that it was their own fault. God warned them and warned them and warned them, and they didn't listen, didn't listen. But one man, together, unified, single purpose, single mind, and however many other things we could add to that list in that same vein. They were as one man, just as a machine almost. Just like Paul used the human body as an analogy of the church. Many members, one body, they all work together, even in ways we don't even understand, or we don't even perceive as it's happening. Like everything you do, your brain is pretty much telling you to do it, but it doesn't feel like that. It's all working together. I am one man here. It all works together, everything I'm doing. So when you have this vast congregation of people assembling as one man, that's the oneness that God desires among his people. In this context, it's talking about this particular situation. But it says, then arose Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, with his fellow priests, and Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, with his kinsmen, and they built the altar of the God of Israel, to offer burnt offerings on it, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. They set the altar in its place. I don't have that part up there yet, but okay. Here's a key thing. They built the altar of the God of Israel. Was that the only altar that ever existed? Is there any point in the history of man, even especially in the Old Testament, that we read about other altars? Of course, plenty. Whether they were altars that had nothing to do with Jehovah, the God of Israel, at all, or whether they were altars that were supposed to be but were used in a different way that inherently made them not the altar of God anymore. It's significant, even though we may take it as obvious that that's the altar they would have built. Not necessarily the case, but they did. They knew what altar to build. It was going into other altars, if you will, that got them in this predicament in the first place. So when these things happen, this sort of reset, the people of God are in an understanding of what to do, what I'm supposed to do. Remember when under David they were transporting the Ark of the Covenant, and that poor man, I say poor man, he had good intentions. Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark because it was about to fall, or at least he perceived it was about to fall, and God struck him dead, and David was just torn up about it, couldn't understand, and finally he had that realization, I get it now. We've been doing this all wrong. God told us how to transport this thing, and we're doing it the way somebody else did it. So if we do it the way God said to do it, we won't have any troubles at all with the rings on the sides and the poles in the rings and the however many men, 4 men maybe designated to carry it, the Levites on their shoulders. Guess what happened when they did that? Smooth sailing. Got all the way where they were going. Not a single hiccup, not a single stumble. Nobody needed to reach out and touch it because God said don't touch it. That David understood now. I get it. Josiah, same way. When Josiah rose up as king and they found the book of the law, and it's just a shocking thing to read that we didn't even know the book of the law was lost until we read that they found it when they were cleaning the temple in some closet somewhere. You ever found something when you were doing a deep clean that you gave up looking for 10 years ago because you know it's gone? It got thrown in the trash accidentally. And you're like, oh, wow, there's that thing. But can you imagine that thing being the Bible or the book of the law for the priesthood and the Israelites? That's a big deal. Josiah understood once he got that book of the law, we're doing a lot of things wrong. We're not doing a lot of these things that we see that God told us to do. So he set it all straight. And then they went downhill again. But that is the cycle that we see. And this is one of those cycles. They had been given a reset. And they're making no mistake about it. We're going to do this as it is written in the law of Moses. Not because we like that idea. Not because that's what Zerubbabel said to do, but because that's what God intends. That's why he gave them those writings. That's why he gave them those commandments and instructions. So they built the altar of the God of Israel to offer burnt offerings on it as it is written. So not only was the altar as God had written, which he did give specifications how to build it in a more permanent sense, how to build it in a more temporary when you're traveling around and how to build it, and he gave instructions on how to offer offerings, acceptable offerings on that altar. So they were doing it all according to the law, as it is written in the law of Moses, the man of God. Same thing with where they put the altar. They set the altar in its place, which seems to suggest there was a place that the altar was supposed to be. Before the temple had ever even been built, they hadn't even started. But they understood where the altar is supposed to be. They set it there. They set it in its place. And then it says, here's the first indication here. For fear was on them because of the peoples of the lands. And they offered burnt offerings on it to Jehovah, burnt offerings morning and evening. So, Yeshua or Joshua, same name. It's Jesus' name, by the way, if you didn't know that. And Zerubbabel are leading in this effort. Yeshua or Joshua was the high priest. Zerubbabel, who was he? The low priest? Huh? He was governor of Judah, which is where they are now. He was governor of Judah. Haggai, by the way, fits right into Ezra and Nehemiah beautifully because they are literally connected. I mean, so we'll probably make references to that at various points throughout this study. Haggai being the primary prophet, I guess we would say, during this time, the one that God called to deal with some issues, which is where we get the idea that maybe they weren't being as decisive and quick in getting started as they should have been, because God had some words for them in Haggai. But anyway, it's underway. They've started. They've built the altar. They set it in its proper place. They are mindful of doing. They're respecting the authority of God's word, as it is written. That was their real motivating factor, or at least their guideline. We're going to do this as it is written. We're going to get this right. Just like David, like I said. We're going to do it right this time. Josiah, we're going to get these things right. And they were very blessed for doing that. They also decided that they needed to start keeping the Feast of Booths. Now, it doesn't, in this text, explicitly say that they hadn't been doing that, but as I mentioned last week, God elsewhere did mention how they didn't really, in a way, they weren't able to operate according to the law during that 70 years. But now again, where'd they get the Feast of Booths from? They just made it up? The law, yeah, see? The law of Moses. That's one of those feasts, those three main feasts that God had commanded. The Feast of Booths, they were going to celebrate that, which was celebrated by building booths. Some of the older versions call it the Feast of Tabernacles. Tabernacle is just I guess we could call it almost a tent, a hut, a little hut tent. When Peter said, Lord, why don't we build 3 tabernacles for you and Moses and Elijah? That's what he's talking about. Not the tabernacle of the law of Moses early on, the wilderness period, but just a little temporary dwelling place, a tent. We'd call it a tent. They would build these, I guess, to translate it into modern day language, in their backyard, in a way, and they would live in those tents for a week. And that was to signify, or to, not signify, but I guess in a way signify, memorialize the wilderness wandering, because they lived in, they would be in those temporary dwellings and they would have to move on eventually. So that's what the Feast of Booths was. They would build these temporary huts outside their actual homes, and they would live in there for a whole week. So they decided, we need to do this as it is written. And they offered the daily burnt offerings by number according to the rule. What is that, 4 times now? As it is written. As it is written, according to the rule. I guess that's 3. As each day required. There's another. I guess that could be a 4th. Required. As is required. As each day required. And after that, the regular burnt offerings, the offerings at the new moon and at all the appointed feasts of Jehovah, and the offerings of everyone who made a free will offering to Jehovah. From the first day of the 7th month, they began to offer burnt offerings to Jehovah, but the foundation of the temple of Jehovah was not yet laid, you see. Foundation, they hadn't even really gotten started on the foundation. It's almost like they're starting on the inside first. Got the altar and whatnot, because they wanted to immediately start making offerings according to the law. Even if the temple doesn't have its structural integrity yet, it's not enclosed in it the way they were going to build it, they could at least start making these offerings on the altar. Why wait until the walls and stuff are up when we could go ahead and do this? Start now, and that seems to be what their resolve was. We're going to go ahead and start making offerings to Jehovah. It says, so they gave money to the masons and the carpenters, and food, drink, and oil to the Sidonians and the Tyrians, however you want to say that, to bring cedar trees from Lebanon, who were renowned for their cedar, their lumber, to the sea, to Joppa, according to the grant that they had from Cyrus, king of Persia. I guess if it wasn't specified earlier, now we see a little bit more detail of the grant that Cyrus, not just that he was going to help, but specifically some of the things that he decreed, which apparently included these things mentioned here, which also included cedar from Lebanon and how to get them there, and I guess whatever cost it would take to get those things there. Probably wasn't cheap, I wouldn't think, to bring a bunch of cedar from Lebanon to Judah through Joppa. So they're getting things together. They're starting to get it together, as it is written. By the way, the purpose of the Feast of Booths was a secondary thing. It was connected with the harvest. So, and the deliverance from Egypt. It was a very important time or thing to remember in their lives. Actually, notice again, all these burnt offerings, as it was written, according to the rule, but in addition to that, there were also free will offerings. Free will offering is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's an offering that you make of your free will. It's in addition to the others. In addition to, for instance, the burnt offerings and the sin offerings and these other things. Then there were, it's like, we've done all the offerings that God has commanded that we do for the purposes and in the time that they're supposed to be done. Now, I want to offer more. So I'm going to make more offerings, free will offerings, according to what people had or desired to offer. And I think there's always a lesson in the free will offerings of the Old Covenant, because we get caught up sometimes with necessary, requirement. What is required? What is my obligation? What is necessary versus what is optional? And our inclination seems to be, I want to know what is necessary because I'm going to stop it right there. That's as far as I'm going to go. Like when the man asked Jesus, okay, who's my neighbor then? Almost like, I want to know who my neighbor is since I'm supposed to love my neighbor, so that way I know who I don't have to love. Who's my neighbor? Okay, I'll love them, but once I know who my neighbor is, then I know all the people I don't have to love. Well, what's required? What is necessary? Because I'm going to draw the line. That's not how they viewed it. They offered further than that. They went beyond. And that's a powerful lesson for us, going beyond what we perceive to be all that's required or necessary. Okay, so verse 8 then, as it was set up in verse 6, the end of verse 6 and verse 7, the foundation of the temple of Jehovah hadn't been laid yet. So they're going to start with that. It says, now in the second year, after their coming to the house of God at Jerusalem, in the second month, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, made a beginning, together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests and the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity. They appointed the Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of Jehovah. Now, this is where we're going to take a little detour to Haggai. Because this verse, it seems to me anyway, is important, or I should say Haggai, what God had for Haggai to tell them is extremely relevant to what we just read. I'll give you a minute or two to find Haggai, by the way. You don't hear that very often. Let's turn to Haggai. Those poor minor prophets that we tend to neglect so much. But it's page 887 in my Bible, if that helps. So Haggai was the first post-captivity minor prophet. And the theme of Haggai was basically this: get to work. Get busy. What are you doing? And again, I already said that the historical narrative of Scripture, in almost all points, is concerned with the facts. This is what happened, and then this happened, and this is what they were doing, and this is what was happening to them, and this is what happened. It doesn't usually give just some other perspective or some other explanation and by the way, this was something that God wasn't very pleased with. The inspired writers don't do that. But when we see these parallel books like Haggai, who was a prophet who was sent to them, we do get God's perspective on the matter. Did you notice that the beginning phrase in Ezra 3:8? In the second year after they came to Jerusalem. Now, there might be an obscurity about what seventh month they're talking about. Probably not, but there might be. But there's not here. It says, the second month after they came to the house of God. That means 2 years it took them. So Haggai, it says, the word of Jehovah came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and Joshua, the high priest. And here's what he said. Haggai 1, verse 2. These people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of Jehovah. Already we just learned something that we didn't get from Ezra. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You were reading from Haggai, not from...
Correct, yeah. Now I am, yeah.
And how did you begin again?
Of Haggai? I didn't read the very beginning, but are you referring to Darius the king?
Yes, it was the second year.
No, the second year is Ezra 3:8.
Right.
Okay, yeah.
Because this is the second year also.
Yeah, it also says the second year.
We are looking at it in perplexed.
In what?
We are looking at this second year of Haggai with perplexed because it is the second year in there.
Mm-hmm.
So we are perplexed.
Well,
So the first year, the year before, was the first year of 2 days. That was when they arrived in Jerusalem. So they arrived in Jerusalem in the first year of 2 days.
there's a perplexity might be a good word because who he was in comparison to Cyrus and what their relationship was and the actual dynamic and how to sort that out is a little bit difficult. But at any rate, there are other time indicators here that he sent this word to Zerubbabel and Joshua. It's clearly before they had started building the temple, because that's the whole point. So we're talking about the same general time period. If we had more time, we could get into who is Darius and what is he to Cyrus. And that same question arises in Daniel whenever it says Darius the Mede took Babylon, the city of Babylon, but it was King Cyrus who was the king. So there apparently was they had some understanding, whoever Darius was, compared to Cyrus. But anyway, God had a word for the people. Remember, they went back and then they went to their own towns. And then 2 years passed. And they still hadn't laid the foundation of the temple. So God says through Haggai, he says, these people say the time hasn't come yet to rebuild the house of Jehovah. And then he said, is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? Now therefore, thus says Jehovah of hosts, consider your ways. I believe that this is one of these situations that is so applicable to us today. Because, here we go. What did they do when they got back? What were they supposed to do? What did God say? What did Jeremiah or Isaiah prophesy? What did Cyrus even say? Go back and do what? Rebuild the temple. Now, obviously, they have to have somewhere to live. Okay, so it's understandable they would need a house in some way. But 2 years passed, and they still hadn't started. And so God tells his prophet Haggai, I've got a word for them. Get busy. What are you doing? What God says they had been doing, it seems by the language here, is they were concerned about their own houses, their own things. They weren't as concerned about the temple of Jehovah, the house of God, as they were the house of me. So that's what they had been doing. He said, well, you say it's not time to build my house? Well, then why do you think it's time to build your house? You determined that it's the time to build your house and furnish it and get it all nice and in order and to your liking, but you still think it's not the time to build my house? What right do you have to say it's not the time to build my house when I told you it is? Yes, sir.
Maybe they were just thinking, well, I just want to do one more thing, get one more thing right, set up one more thing, then I'll...
Exactly. I'm sure that was part of it.
I don't know if they'd be that dishonest. Well, we'll do it later.
Yeah, well, we have a way of justifying things, especially procrastination. It's easy to justify procrastination. One of the things that they obviously would have used, that we do get a hint of in the Ezra account, is the people that were putting pressure on them. So you got people around watching, so to speak, or that you perceive as watching, as they're waiting for you to, they're applying pressure, they're sort of intimidating you, so that, you might say, well, we'll just wait for it to settle down a little bit. Wait until they'll get distracted, they can't do this forever. So whenever they get bored and stop paying attention to us, then we'll get started. And then, once we get in that mindset, it's easy to always convince ourselves that it's still not the right time. It's still not time. I don't know when the right time is, but I know it's not now. And again, God's perspective is, I said it is the right time. How many times did that general situation happen in the history of Israel? Saul was supposed to destroy everything and the animals and everything, and God said, you do that. Saul decided, maybe that wouldn't be the best thing. We should save these good ones. Why would we destroy these good, valuable things, these animals? Samuel went to him and said, what you've done is pretty foolish. God told you to do something. You don't have the right to say, maybe we should do something else. Same thing with driving out the inhabitants of the land, for that matter. You better drive all of them out. The people decided, well, we drove most of them out. That'd be good enough. I'm not really concerned with driving the rest of them out. We've scattered. They're on the borders. What harm could they possibly cause? We substantially did what God said. And guess what happened? The very thing that God told them would probably happen if they didn't do it, happened. And over that kind of thing happens. It's every time man decides that he knows better than God, it ends in some sort of tragedy or unfortunate circumstance.
Isn't there like a saying that the path to hell is paved with good intentions?
Yeah, the road to hell paved with good intentions. This is the kind of thing that I refer to as a Romans 9:20 problem. Who are you to reply against God? Who are you, old man, to reply against God? Why do we always think we know better than God? Now, most of us here would not ever think that actually, I know better than God, but our actions suggest otherwise. Just like you think they were telling each other, God just doesn't know, he doesn't understand. Like we did as teenagers with our parents, our parents don't understand anything, Yeah, they lived there, they were a teenager once, but it was different then than it is now, and they just don't understand, so we got to cut them some slack, bless their hearts, You think they were saying that to each other actually? God doesn't really understand what's going on down here, so he will understand if we wait a little longer. No, they weren't actually saying that. But in consistently delaying and pushing back and pushing back and pushing it back, they were saying, God says, it's not time to rebuild. When God said it is time to rebuild. And that should be all that matters. I said it's time. Where's your faith? You're afraid of them more than you are me. Maybe that's your problem. Do you have something else? Did I see a hand over here? Okay, just making sure, because you're in my blind spot, so you might have to throw something at me or shout. So I guess we don't have to say much more about Haggai. Our book doesn't take us to Haggai, but I think it's relevant because it gives us a little bit more detail. That it's not just, that in the second year, that's the first time they were able to get started. Why did they start in the second year? Why did they start when they started? It's because Haggai went and gave them a chewing on God's behalf. That's what it was. Haggai went and said, y'all better get busy. Get off your rear ends and get started with this. Stop worrying. Everybody's worried about their own house. That's what it says in, by the way, Haggai 1:9. My house lies in ruins while each of you busies himself with his own house. Yes.
And they were being punished for things weren't going as well as they should.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what he meant when he said, it seems when he said consider your ways, I guess that could work both ways. Consider what you're doing and also consider this. You've sown much and you're harvesting little. Have you not noticed this? You didn't think of that? Why do you think that might be happening? Well, God is clearly suggesting that he's the reason that's happening because of what they're doing. So Haggai got this ball rolling, so to speak, but again, there's that spiritual lesson that just has always stuck with me because of how true it is for the church today. My house lies in ruins, God says, while each of you busies himself with his own house. That sums up so much of the struggles of the cause of Christ today. We're too busy with our own houses, our own lives, filling up our plates, so to speak, with all these extracurricular activities that we use as justification for not having time for God and his cause. Building up his house, if you will. Okay, back to Ezra then. So they get started. They make a beginning finally, thanks to Haggai. I would pencil in there if you do that. See Haggai 1 and 2 at the beginning of verse 8, because these kinds of chain references are so crucial to gaining more and more understanding of the Scripture narrative. Because like I said, the things that we learn from Haggai 1 and 2, we don't get from this. Just like some of the things that we get from Luke, we don't get from Matthew. And we get from John that we don't get from Mark. And you put it together, and you get a fuller picture. You may not get the full picture, because every detail can't be recorded. But you get the fullest picture that we can get. So, together with the rest of their kinsmen, the priests, the Levites, and all who had come to Jerusalem from the captivity, they appointed the Levites from 20 years old upward. Jeshua with his sons and his brothers, and Kadmiel and his sons, and the sons of Judah, together supervised the workmen of the house of God, along with the sons of Henadad and the Levites, their sons and brothers. When the builders laid the foundation of the temple of Jehovah, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals, to praise Jehovah according to the directions of David, king of Israel. Another significant phrase. We don't have time to get into that, but we'll see. We will reference that later this morning, ironically, if we want to call it ironically. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to Jehovah, for he is good, and his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised Jehovah, because the foundation of the house of Jehovah was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people couldn't distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. So there's this picture painted, the foundation, or maybe the very, very fundamental part of the foundation, because there is a little bit of another seeming perplexity, a little bit of, it's almost like they laid two foundations, but I guess we could understand it as maybe the basis, the very basic portion of the foundation, and then maybe a completion in the foundation later. But when they saw it, you know, you start a house maybe, and you get the foundation laid, and you can fill in the gaps with your head, of okay, this is the shape of it, and I can see what it's going to look like. Some people, the younger generation, was overcome with joy just at the house being rebuilt. But there were a few there who were actually old enough to have, it seems, actually seen the old temple. They were probably kids. Young kids, or maybe they remembered it in some of them probably remembered it in some other way, but the text says that some of them had seen the first house. They were weeping with not maybe mingled tears of joy, but also tears of sadness, because it was so inferior. Solomon's temple was, it was the thing. It was it. It was amazing. Now things are a lot more humble. And I would argue exactly the way God would want it to be, because we know what they ended up doing with Solomon's temple was turning it basically into an idol. Even Herod the Great later added to the temple and made it, some said, even more beautiful than Solomon's was. And we know how the apostles viewed it. They as they left in Matthew 24, they were, admiring it. Look at that, how amazing it is. That kind of thing just tends to lead people to miss the point. The tabernacle is what God really wanted. That's what he told Moses. The temple was David's idea, and God told him that. I don't want you to build me a temple, but if you insist, fine, I'll let you do it. It's only going to be temporary anyway in the big picture. But this new one was much more lowly, much more humble, just like they were. They had been purged in a way, which God had done it multiple times over their history. They were purged. They had been brought low. And as I pointed out last week, they weren't a free sovereign nation anymore, never would be again. But they had what they had, what God had given them, their freedom, at least as far as this goes. Not total freedom, but they were able to live in their own land, and that was a big step. So there was mingled joy and mingled sadness, and the sound was heard far away. I like how that ends too. Do we make a joyful shout that can be heard far away? Not literally. I don't mean literally. But, yeah, that too. Yeah, that could be good. If we could sing loud enough that people could hear it outside, over the train, that would be, that'd be something. But what about in our lives? The shout of our lives? Do people hear it afar off? Okay, we're out of time, but we must serve God no matter what happens. Who cares if there are people who want to persecute you for serving God? That's the mistake they made. It's not time. Too much pressure. It's a little too hot. We need to wait for it to cool down a little bit, wait for these people to go off and bother somebody else. No. Do what God says. Come what may. And we don't have the right to change what God has authorized. When it is written, as it is written. That's the emphasis over and over in this text. That's not something that the New Testament isn't concerned with, by the way. But when there is something that God has spoken, or when it is written, that's it. That's that. And the wise course of action is to do that. Do it as it is written. Oh. For sincere in our efforts to please God, certain events will similarly stir our emotions. Worship is not an emotional, strictly emotional exercise. It's not just about stirring up emotions. That should be a part of it, though. It's not all about that, like some people seem to think, so that it doesn't even matter as long as your emotions are stirred up. That's worship. That's not worship. Worship should be emotional, but the emotionalism is not the worship. The worship should include our emotions, and which is another way of saying it should be in the heart, from the heart.